October 24, 1944, at 23:17 hours in the Taiwan Strait, USS Tang is running on the surface at 16 knots, while Commander Richard O'Kane stands on the bridge scanning the dark horizon through binoculars, searching for the Japanese convoy that he has been tracking for the past 3 hours. The night is moonless and perfect for hunting, and Tang is on her 5th war patrol after sinking 24 enemy ships in 4 previous missions, making O'Kane the most successful submarine captain in the Pacific Fleet, with a reputation for aggressive tactics and remarkable survival instincts. Tonight he is tracking a convoy of 7 cargo ships escorted by 2 destroyer escorts, and he has been waiting patiently for exactly the right moment to attack when the geometry and timing will allow Tang to inflict maximum damage before disappearing into the darkness. O'Kane gives the order for Battle Station's Torpedo, and the crew moves with practiced efficiency because they have done this 93 times before across 5 war patrols, making them one of the most experienced and deadly submarine crews in the Pacific theater. Tang carries 87 men aboard, and every single one of them knows his job perfectly after countless hours of drilling and real combat experience that has welded them into a seamless fighting unit. The torpedo room crew loads the final spread into tubes 1 through 6, while O'Kane calculates the firing solution with the help of his executive officer, determining that the convoy is at range 1,200 yards, traveling at speed 12 knots on bearing 287 degrees. He orders Fire Tube 1, Fire Tube 2, Fire Tube 3, and 3. Mark 18 electric torpedoes leave Tang's bow tubes and race toward the convoy at 46 knots, while O'Kane watches through the periscope and counts the seconds until impact, waiting for the telltale explosions that will confirm his targeting calculations were correct. The first torpedo hits a cargo ship amidships after exactly 49 seconds, and the explosion lights up the entire night sky while the ship breaks in half and begins sinking immediately, followed 2 seconds later by the second torpedo striking another cargo ship in the stern and sending that vessel to the bottom as well. The third torpedo misses its target completely, passing harmlessly through the convoy formation and disappearing into the darkness. But O'Kane has no time to worry about one miss because he immediately orders Fire Tube 4, Fire Tube 5, Fire Tube 6, sending 3 more torpedoes toward the scattering convoy while the crew works frantically to reload the forward tubes for a potential second salvo. Tang still has 8 torpedoes remaining in her arsenal, and O'Kane plans to fire every single one of them tonight, intending to sink the entire convoy before the destroyer escorts can organize an effective response and force Tang to dive and evade. Tube 4 strikes a tanker and causes a massive explosion as thousands of gallons of fuel ignite and burn on the water's surface, creating a hellish orange glow that illuminates the entire area and makes Tang temporarily visible to anyone looking in the right direction. Tube 5 hits one of the destroyer escorts directly amidships, stopping the warship dead in the water and eliminating it as a threat before it can even begin searching for the submarine that just attacked it. Tube 6 misses again, the second miss out of 6 shots, and O'Kane feels a twinge of frustration because Tang's torpedoes are normally extremely reliable with a much higher hit rate than what he is seeing tonight. But there is absolutely no time to think about why the torpedoes might be malfunctioning because the convoy is scattering in all directions and the remaining destroyer escort is turning directly toward Tang's position, forcing O'Kane to order an emergency dive before the warship can close the distance and pin them down with depth charges. Tang's bow drops sharply as the submarine slides beneath the surface, descending through 60 feet, then 80 feet, then 100 feet, while O'Kane orders level off at 120 feet, and the entire crew goes silent, shutting down all unnecessary equipment and stopping all movement so that the submarine becomes as quiet as possible and harder to detect on enemy sonar. Everyone can hear the destroyer passing overhead, the deep thrumming sound of its propellers getting louder and louder as it approaches, then gradually fading as it moves past without apparently detecting Tang's position beneath the waves. O'Kane thinks they are safe and have successfully evaded detection, but then sonar operator Second Class William Leibold reports multiple splashes on the surface directly above them. And O'Kane realizes with a sinking feeling that the destroyer did detect them after all, and is now dropping depth charges that are falling through the water toward Tang at 120 feet depth, right in the middle of the typical kill zone for Japanese depth charges. The crew braces for the explosions, knowing that depth charges typically detonate at preset depths between 50 and 150 feet, depending on how the attacking ship sets the fuses. And Tang is sitting at 120 feet, which means they are potentially in the lethal blast radius of every single charge dropping toward them right now. The first explosion hits, but sounds distant and too far away to cause damage, followed by the second explosion, which is also distant, then the third and fourth explosions, which are similarly far from Tang's actual position, even though the destroyer dropped the charges directly above them. O'Kane cannot understand why the charges are exploding hundreds of yards away from Tang when they should be detonating right on top of the submarine and causing catastrophic damage. But the pressure waves from the explosions rock Tang violently enough to shatter light bulbs and send dust falling from the overhead pipes, while the crew holds on and waits to see if the next salvo will be closer and more accurate. The destroyer makes a second pass and drops more depth charges, and this time the explosions are closer, but still not close enough to cause serious structural damage to Tang's pressure hull, leading O'Kane to make a calculated decision to go deeper to 180 feet, in hopes of getting below the effective blast radius of the charges. Tang descends to 180 feet depth, which is deep for a Balao-class submarine whose official crush depth is listed as 400 feet. But which no captain in his right mind would ever test by going that deep except in the most desperate circumstances. The destroyer drops 8 more charges on this third pass, and O'Kane counts each explosion carefully and notes that all of them are detonating too shallow, probably around 60 or 70 feet depth, based on the sound characteristics, which means they are exploding more than 100 feet above Tang's current position and pose no immediate threat to the submarine's survival. O'Kane begins to realize something important about the pattern of depth charge failures he is observing tonight, because this is not the first time he has noticed Japanese depth charges exploding at the wrong depth and failing to damage American submarines that should have been destroyed. Other submarine captains have reported similar experiences during their war patrols, describing depth charge attacks that should have been devastating but somehow failed to cause significant damage, and everyone assumed it was just a combination of luck and good evasive tactics that kept them alive. But O'Kane is starting to suspect that there is something systematically wrong with Japanese depth charge fuses, either because they are set incorrectly at the factory or because they are malfunctioning in some way that causes them to explode too shallow, giving American submarines a crucial survival advantage that the Japanese do not realize they have given away. The destroyer finally gives up after making 3 passes and dropping 47 total depth charges without achieving a single hit or causing any damage to Tang, and Leibold reports that the propeller sounds are fading away as the warship moves off to search other areas for the submarine that attacked the convoy. O'Kane waits another 30 minutes to make absolutely certain the destroyer is gone before ordering Tang back to periscope depth at 60 feet. And when he raises the periscope and scans the area, he sees that the convoy has scattered and fled, but one cargo ship is still burning and dead in the water, making it an easy target for Tang's remaining torpedoes. O'Kane decides to finish off the crippled ship before leaving the area, calculating a firing solution at nearly point-blank range of just 800 yards, and he orders Fire Tube 7 to send the torpedo from the aft tube racing toward the helpless cargo ship that has no chance of evading or surviving the hit. O'Kane watches through the periscope as the torpedo runs straight and normal for the first 20 seconds, but then something goes terribly wrong, and the weapon starts turning in a wide arc instead of continuing on its straight course toward the target. O'Kane realizes immediately that this is a circular run caused by a failed gyroscope inside the torpedo's guidance system, which means the weapon is now running in an uncontrolled circle, and Tang is positioned directly in that circle's path, with no time to calculate an escape route or take effective evasive action. He shouts emergency dive, all ahead flank, right full rudder, and Tang's bow drops sharply while the engines scream at maximum power, and the submarine turns hard right, trying desperately to evade the torpedo that Tang herself just fired moments ago. The crew does not initially understand what is happening because they just hear the captain shouting urgent orders and feel the submarine turning violently. But then Leibold reports over the intercom that there is a torpedo in the water on bearing 090 with range closing rapidly, and suddenly everyone understands with cold horror that their own weapon has malfunctioned and is now coming back to kill them all. In the aft torpedo room, Chief Jesse Da Silva hears the report and looks at the 8 loaded torpedoes stored around him, realizing instantly that if the incoming circular run torpedo hits anywhere near this compartment, all 9 weapons will detonate simultaneously, and Tang will not sink slowly, but will instead vaporize in a massive explosion that will erase all 87 men from existence in less than a second. Da Silva starts counting down the seconds to impact while looking at the faces of his torpedo room crew, including Torpedo Man 2nd Class James Murphy, Torpedo Man 3rd Class Charles Andriolo, and Motor Machinist 1st Class William Ballinger, all good men who are about to die because their own weapon malfunctioned through no fault of theirs or anyone else aboard Tang. Da Silva counts 30 seconds to impact, then 25 seconds, then 20 seconds, then 15 seconds as he stops counting and starts praying because there is literally nothing else he can do except wait for the explosion and hope that death comes quickly and painlessly for him and his crew. O'Kane is doing everything humanly possible to evade the torpedo, ordering Tang to turn and dive and accelerate simultaneously. But the torpedo is traveling at 46 knots, while Tang's maximum submerged speed is only 20 knots. Making it mathematically impossible to outrun the weapon that is rapidly closing the distance. The range drops to 400 yards, then 300 yards, then 200 yards, and O'Kane orders hard left rudder in a last desperate attempt to turn inside the torpedo's turning radius, and by some miracle the weapon misses Tang's stern by approximately 10 feet and passes down the port side, while everyone aboard thinks they are safe and have somehow survived the impossible. But the torpedo is still running and still circling, and it completes another full loop and comes back toward Tang from a different angle, and this time there is absolutely no time left to evade or take any defensive action whatsoever before the torpedo slams into Tang's aft torpedo room and detonates with catastrophic force. The aft torpedo room is destroyed instantly and completely, with Da Silva, Murphy, Andriolo, and Ballinger all killed before their brains can even process what is happening to them, and the massive explosion ruptures the pressure hull and allows seawater to flood into the compartment at tremendous force, driven by the water pressure at Tang's current depth. The compartment fills completely in less than 10 seconds, and because the watertight door between the aft torpedo room and the after engine room was left open during combat operations, water rushes through into the engine room, where engine room machinist 2nd Class James Culp tries desperately to close the door against the incoming torrent, but is swept away by the current before he can dog it shut. Culp tries to climb toward the upper escape hatch, but the water pulls him down, and he grabs a pipe to hold himself in place, but the pipe is slippery with oil, and his hands lose their grip, and he goes under and surfaces once more, gasping for air before the water level rises past his waist, then his chest, then his neck. Motor Machinist 1st Class Hayes. Truca is also trapped in the flooding engine room and is trying desperately to reach the watertight door to the forward engine room while screaming for help that will never come because everyone forward of the flooding is frantically trying to save the submarine from sinking. The water is at Truca's neck now and rising fast, and he takes one final deep breath and shouts one last word, which is his wife's name, Dorothy. And then the water covers his head completely, and the overhead is gone, and the entire compartment is flooded from deck to overhead. Culp, Truca, Chief Motor Machinist William Parks, and Electrician Second Class Floyd Caverly all drown in the flooding engine room in less than 90 seconds, bringing the total death toll from the torpedo hit to 8 men lost in 2 compartments that are now completely flooded and sealed and unreachable from the rest of the submarine. The submarine is sinking stern first at a dangerous angle because of all the water flooding into the aft compartments, and O'Kane orders blow all ballast tanks for an emergency surface before Tang sinks below crush depth and implodes. The high-pressure air system activates and forces compressed air into the main ballast tanks to displace the water and create buoyancy, and Tang's bow rises sharply, but the stern continues sinking because there is simply too much water back there and too much weight pulling the submarine down. The angle increases to 35 degrees, then 40 degrees as men slide backward down the tilted deck and equipment breaks loose and crashes into bulkheads. And O'Kane realizes with sick certainty that they cannot surface with this much flooding in the stern, dragging them down toward the bottom. O'Kane makes an agonizing decision to stop trying to surface and instead to level off at depth and reassess the situation, ordering secure the blow and flood-forward ballast tanks to level the submarine by adding weight to the bow to counterbalance the flooded stern. The forward tanks flood on command, and the angle slowly decreases from 40 degrees to 35 degrees to 30 degrees until Tang finally levels off at 180 feet depth. But the price of this temporary survival is that the aft compartments remain completely flooded with 8 men dead and both diesel engines underwater and useless, leaving Tang running on battery power alone with perhaps 36 hours of electrical capacity before the batteries die, and the submarine becomes a dead steel coffin drifting in enemy waters. O'Kane calls for damage reports from all stations, and Engineering Officer Lieutenant Frank Springer reports that the aft torpedo room is destroyed, the after engine room is flooded, the maneuvering room is sealed but damaged, electrical systems are failing throughout the boat, hydraulics are offline, and the main motors are operational but running exclusively on battery power with no way to recharge because both diesel engines are submerged and cannot be restarted. Medical Officer Lieutenant Larry Savadkin reports 8 men confirmed dead, with 11 more injured, including 2 critically wounded sailors who may not survive the next few hours without proper medical treatment that Savadkin cannot provide in these conditions. Executive Officer Lieutenant Frank O'Hara summarizes the tactical situation by noting that Tang cannot surface safely because the destroyer that attacked them earlier might still be in the area and would sink them with gunfire if they surfaced. But if Tang stays submerged, then the batteries will die in approximately 36 hours, and after that, the submarine will have no propulsion, no lights, no air circulation, and no life support systems. O'Kane asks Springer directly whether there is any possibility of repairing the diesel engines or pumping out the flooded compartments so they can restore propulsion and surface capability. But Springer delivers the devastating news that the engine room is completely flooded with water pressure at 180 feet depth, exceeding 80 pounds per square inch, making it impossible to open the watertight doors or access the engines or pump out the water until Tang surfaces, which creates an impossible circular logic problem because they cannot surface without engine power, but they cannot repair the engines without surfacing first. Springer calculates that with absolute minimum power consumption, they might stretch the battery life to 34 hours, but probably not any longer than that, while Savadkin calculates that the submarine's approximately 12,000 cubic feet of free airspace will support 79 surviving men for perhaps 60 hours before the carbon dioxide scrubbers become saturated and everyone dies of CO2 poisoning, meaning the real limiting factor is not battery power, but breathable air. O'Kane makes the critical decision that they must surface immediately before anything else goes wrong, or before the destroyer returns, or before they lose any more capability to act, ordering blow all remaining ballast tanks and use every last bit of compressed air to force Tang to the surface one final time. The air system activates and Tang starts rising slowly from 180 feet depth, with the bow rising at a dangerous 25-degree angle because the stern is still flooded and heavy, and O'Kane orders reduce angle by flooding forward trim tanks slightly to bring the bow down and level the submarine as it ascends. Tang rises through 140 feet, then 100 feet, then 60 feet, then 40 feet, then 20 feet, and finally the conning tower breaks through the surface into fresh air at aero-forward 20 hours after 5 hours, submerged in a damaged submarine that should have sunk but somehow managed to survive through a combination of good damage control and sheer stubborn refusal to give up. O'Kane opens the bridge hatch and climbs topside and takes his first breath of fresh air in 5 hours, and the sensation is overwhelming after breathing the stale, recycled air inside the submarine that was growing increasingly toxic with carbon dioxide. He scans the horizon carefully with binoculars, but sees no ships and no destroyers and no immediate threats, which means they are temporarily alone and safe, but also means they are stranded with no engines and limited battery power and no way to call for help because their radio was damaged in the explosion. O'Kane orders damage assessment teams to go topside and inspect the exterior damage, and the engineers report that the stern is riding dangerously low in the water because of the flooded compartments pulling it down. The engine room access hatches are underwater and cannot be opened, and there is absolutely no way to reach the diesel engines from outside the submarine, which means the only possible access route is through the flooded interior compartments that are currently sealed and unreachable. Chief Engineer Springer delivers his final assessment that the engines are completely gone and unrepairable at sea, leaving Tang dependent entirely on battery power that will last perhaps 32 hours at current drain rate, or maybe 36 hours maximum if they shut down absolutely everything non-essential and run at minimum power consumption. O'Kane calculates the distance to friendly territory and realizes the nearest Allied position is Leyte Gulf in the Philippines, approximately 400 miles south, where the United States just began a major invasion operation 3 days ago on October 21, 1944. If Tang could somehow reach Leyte, then they might find help and support, but traveling 400 miles on battery power alone is mathematically impossible because Tang's batteries give them a maximum range of perhaps 100 miles at 2 knots, nowhere near the 400 miles they would need to reach safety. Executive Officer O'Hara suggests an alternative plan that involves sailing to a much closer destination, specifically Ishigaki Island, which is located 85 miles southwest of Tang's current position. And even though the island is Japanese-controlled with a harbor and military presence, perhaps they could hide there temporarily and repair the submarine or scuttle it properly and escape to the mainland somehow, or at least buy themselves more time and more options than they currently have drifting helplessly in the middle of enemy waters. O'Kane considers this terrible plan carefully and realizes it is absolutely insane to sail a crippled American submarine directly into a Japanese harbor. But it is still better than staying here and waiting to die when the batteries run out, or the next Japanese patrol finds them. So O'Kane agrees they will attempt to reach Ishigaki Island because 85 miles is a distance Tang might barely be able to cover on remaining battery power if everything goes perfectly and nothing else breaks. O'Kane orders set course for Ishigaki Island at all ahead, slow for 2 knots to conserve maximum battery power, and the helmsman sets the course while Tang begins moving painfully slowly across the ocean with the flooded stern dragging behind like an anchor and the batteries draining steadily with every passing minute. O'Kane remains on the bridge watching the horizon constantly for any sign of Japanese ships or aircraft while simultaneously watching for dawn, which is coming in approximately 90 minutes and will make Tang clearly visible to any enemy forces in the area. They desperately need to reach Ishigaki before dawn breaks and exposes them, but the math is brutally clear that 85 miles at 2 knots equals 42.5 hours of travel time, while they only have 90 minutes until sunrise, making it completely impossible to reach the island before daylight reveals their position to anyone looking in the right direction. O'Kane does the final calculation in his head and realizes they are going to be caught on the surface in broad daylight in a crippled submarine deep in Japanese-controlled waters with no engines and no ability to dive and no means of escape or defense. And this reality means that in 90 minutes, when the sun comes up and the first Japanese patrol plane spots them sitting helplessly on the surface, everything they have survived up until this point will mean absolutely nothing, because Tang will die, and everyone aboard will die with her. O'Kane has run out of miracles and run out of options and run out of time, and all he can do now is stand on the bridge and watch the eastern horizon gradually lighten as dawn approaches, bringing with it the light that will reveal Tang's position and seal the fate of 79 men who fought so hard and survived so much only to be caught in broad daylight with nowhere to hide and no way to fight back and no hope of escape. October 25, 1944, at 0530 hours, as dawn breaks over the Taiwan Strait, Tang is still on the surface, moving at a painfully slow 2 knots and still 78 miles from Ishigaki Island, having survived the night, but facing a new day that brings with it new dangers and new ways to die. The eastern sky transforms gradually from black to gray to pink to orange as the sun rises, and O'Kane watches this natural beauty with a growing sense of dread, because daylight means visibility, and visibility means being spotted by Japanese patrol planes that will certainly be searching this area after last night's convoy attack. He has been standing on the bridge for 7 consecutive hours without rest or relief, and his eyes burn with exhaustion while his legs ache and threaten to give out beneath him. But he cannot leave this position because he needs to see any threat before it sees Tang, so that he can gain those precious few extra seconds needed to dive or evade or do whatever desperate action might keep them alive for another hour. At 0547 hours, Leibold's voice crackles over the intercom reporting aircraft contact on bearing 045 at unknown range, and O'Kane immediately scans the sky in that direction, but sees nothing because the sun is rising directly on that bearing and blinding him with its brilliant light. Leibold heard the contact on passive sonar and is reporting high-pitched propeller sounds getting steadily louder, which means an aircraft is approaching Tang's position and closing rapidly, even though O'Kane cannot see it yet, through the sun glare that is both protecting them and making it impossible to track the threat. O'Kane makes an instant decision and orders emergency dive before the plane spots them, and Tang's klaxon sounds its urgent alarm while the crew scrambles to diving stations and the main ballast tank vents open to allow air to rush out and water to rush in and pull the submarine beneath the surface. Tang's deck goes underwater first, followed by the conning tower, and O'Kane is the last man down the bridge hatch as always, because the captain is always the last to leave the bridge during an emergency dive, and he dogs the hatch shut behind him and drops into the control room while ordering depth 180 feet. The submarine descends more slowly than usual because the flooded stern compartments are fighting against the dive and making Tang heavy and sluggish and unresponsive to depth control, and O'Kane watches the depth gauge climb through 60 feet, then 80 feet, then 100 feet, then 120 feet, then 140 feet, then 160 feet, before Tang finally levels off at 180 feet depth. But this emergency dive just cost them 4 hours of precious battery life, according to Springer's grim report, which means they now have only 28 hours of power remaining instead of the 32 hours they started with, and that 4-hour loss might be the difference between reaching Ishigaki Island and dying in the water short of their destination. O'Kane asks Leibold whether the aircraft saw them before they submerged, and Leibold listens carefully to the propeller sounds for several long minutes before reporting that the sounds are moving away and fading, which means the plane passed over without detecting Tang and continued east without turning back to investigate. They are safe for now, but O'Kane knows this was incredibly close, and they might not be so lucky the next time an aircraft passes overhead, so he orders silent running at minimum power while Tang drifts at 180 feet depth, waiting for the plane to leave the area completely before they can risk surfacing again to continue their desperate journey toward Ishigaki. But something is wrong with the air inside the submarine, and pharmacist mate First Class Hayes Walker is the first to notice the problem while checking on injured men in the forward torpedo room, where Torpedo Man First Class John Hubeck has a broken arm from the explosion, and motor machinist Second Class Jesse Dastek has severe burns on his hands from fighting the fires. Both injured men are breathing much faster than normal and gasping for air as though they cannot get enough oxygen into their lungs, and Walker checks their pulses and discovers they are running at 110 beats per minute when normal resting heart rate should be around 70 beats per minute. Walker checks their pupils next and sees they are dilated, which combined with the rapid breathing and elevated heart rate tells him exactly what is happening, and the realization fills him with cold dread because he knows the carbon dioxide scrubbers are failing and the air is going bad and everyone aboard is slowly being poisoned. Walker reports immediately to Medical Officer Savadkin, who rushes to the control room and checks the CO2 indicator gauge, which reads 2.1%, when it should read less than 0.5% for safe breathing. And Savadkin knows from his medical training that anything above 2% causes symptoms like headaches and dizziness and rapid breathing, while anything above 4% causes unconsciousness, and anything above 8% causes death. Tang's carbon dioxide scrubbers are designed to keep CO2 levels below 1% through chemical absorption of the exhaled carbon dioxide, but the scrubbers have been running continuously for 8 hours since the torpedo hit, and they are now completely saturated and failing to absorb any more CO2, which means the level will continue climbing until everyone aboard loses consciousness and dies. Savadkin reports this catastrophic situation to O'Kane and explains that they need to change the scrubber canisters immediately. But the spare canisters are stored in the after-engine room, which is flooded and sealed and completely inaccessible, which means there are no more scrubbers available, and the air will just keep getting worse until the CO2 reaches lethal levels in approximately 6 to 8 hours, and everyone dies of poisoning. O'Kane asks whether there is anything they can do to extend the time before the CO2 becomes lethal, and Savadkin explains that the only option is to reduce the crew's metabolic rate by having everyone lie down and remain motionless and breathe slowly and calmly to reduce oxygen consumption and CO2 production, which might buy them an additional 4 to 6 hours before the air becomes unbreathable. O'Kane immediately orders the entire crew to minimum activity, with everyone except essential watchstanders lying down in their bunks or finding comfortable positions on the deck where they can remain still and quiet and breathe as slowly as possible to conserve the remaining breathable air for as long as they can stretch it. The crew follows orders and lies down throughout the submarine, in the torpedo rooms and the control room and the crew quarters, everyone trying not to panic and trying not to think about the fact that they are slowly suffocating in a sealed steel tube with no escape and no rescue coming. But panic is incredibly contagious in confined spaces, and in the forward torpedo room, Torpedo Man Third Class Clayton Decker starts hyperventilating uncontrollably, gulping air in rapid gasps and using far too much oxygen while producing far too much carbon dioxide with his panicked breathing pattern. Walker tries desperately to calm Decker down by telling him to breathe slowly through his nose and out through his mouth in a controlled rhythm. But Decker cannot hear the instructions because he is having a full-blown panic attack and his rational mind has completely shut down under the overwhelming fear of suffocation. Decker's pupils are dilated to maximum size and his pulse is racing at 140 beats per minute, and his hands are clawing frantically at his own throat because he feels like his windpipe is closing and cutting off his air supply, even though his windpipe is actually fine and the problem is entirely psychological rather than physical. But Decker cannot tell the difference between panic and actual suffocation, and his brain is convinced he is dying right now, so his body reacts by trying to rip open his own throat to find air that he thinks is not there, and his fingernails dig into the skin of his neck and draw blood as he scratches desperately, trying to open an airway that is not blocked. Walker calls for help, and torpedoman Second Class Paul Larson grabs Decker's arms while motor machinist First Class Howard Walker grabs his legs, and together they pin Decker to the deck to prevent him from hurting himself further, but Decker keeps fighting and flailing and manages to bite down hard on Walker's hand, drawing blood before Walker can pull away from the bite. Decker is no longer screaming words, but instead making primal animal sounds that are the sound of a man who believes he is dying and cannot be reasoned with or calmed down through rational conversation, and the horrifying noises echo through the submarine and reach O'Kane in the control room, where he immediately understands what is happening. O'Kane knows from experience that one man panicking can trigger a cascade of panic throughout an entire crew, especially when everyone is already scared and stressed and breathing bad air. So he quickly makes his way forward to the torpedo room and kneels beside Decker and speaks quietly and calmly, saying, "Decker, look at me. Breathe with me, in and out, in and out." O'Kane demonstrates slow, exaggerated breathing while maintaining eye contact with Decker, and gradually Decker's panicked eyes focus on O'Kane's face and recognize his captain and begin matching the slow breathing rhythm that O'Kane is demonstrating. And the screaming stops, and the struggling stops, and Decker closes his eyes and lies still in complete exhaustion, with blood streaking his neck where his fingernails cut the skin, and blood on Walker's hand where Decker bit him. O'Kane stays with Decker for 5 full minutes to make absolutely certain he is stable and calm before returning to the control room. But O'Kane knows with absolute certainty that Decker will not be the last crew member to break under this psychological pressure, because the air is continuing to get worse, and the CO2 levels are continuing to climb, and more men will panic as they feel themselves slowly suffocating. O'Kane just hopes they can surface before the panic spreads beyond his ability to control it, and before the crew starts killing each other in their desperate attempts to reach fresh air that does not exist anywhere inside this sealed submarine. At 07:20 hours after Tang has been submerged for 93 minutes, Leibold reports that all aircraft sounds have faded completely, and the area appears to be clear of enemy contacts. So O'Kane orders prepare to surface, even though Springer delivers the devastating news that the battery is now down to only 22 hours of remaining capacity after the emergency dive consumed another 6 hours of power. They cannot afford many more emergency dives because each one burns through hours of battery life that they desperately need for making forward progress toward Ishigaki Island. And Springer calculates that they have maybe 1 or 2 more dives left before the battery dies completely and Tang becomes a dead hulk drifting helplessly on the surface. O'Kane acknowledges this grim reality and orders Tang to surface, and the submarine blows its main ballast tanks and rises toward the surface and breaks through into fresh air at 07:20 hours. O'Kane opens the bridge hatch and climbs topside and takes his first breath of fresh morning air. And the sensation is like a powerful drug hitting his system after breathing the increasingly toxic air inside the submarine for the past 93 minutes, and his head immediately clears and his headache fades, and he suddenly realizes just how bad the air had become and how close they all came to losing consciousness from CO2 poisoning. O'Kane immediately orders ventilate the boat, and even though the main diesel engine hatches are underwater and sealed because of the flooded stern, there are smaller ventilation hatches on the deck that the crew opens to allow fresh air to pour into the submarine and displace the stale poisoned air that has been slowly killing them. The CO2 levels drop rapidly, from 2.1% down to 1.8%, then 1.5%, then 1.2%, as fresh air circulates throughout the boat, and the crew breathes deeply, and some men are actually crying with relief at the simple joy of breathing clean air and not dying, at least not yet. Decker wakes up in the torpedo room feeling embarrassed and ashamed about his panic attack, and he tries to apologize to everyone around him, but nobody blames him or thinks less of him because everyone understands that they are all equally scared, and Decker just happened to be the first one to show it openly. O'Kane orders resume course toward Ishigaki Island at 2 knots to conserve battery power, and Tang continues her slow, painful journey with 70 miles still remaining and only 22 hours of battery life available. and the brutal math shows that 70 miles at 2 knots requires 35 hours of travel time, which means they will run out of power. 13 hours short of reaching their destination, but O'Kane refuses to give up or acknowledge defeat, because giving up means death, and he is not ready to let his crew die without exhausting every possible option first. At 11:40 hours, the forward lookout spots a ship on the horizon at bearing 180 and estimated range of 8 miles, and O'Kane raises his binoculars and identifies the vessel as a Japanese patrol boat, displacing perhaps 400 tons and heading north directly toward Tang's position. The patrol boat has not spotted them yet, despite Tang being clearly visible on the surface in broad daylight, which seems almost impossible until O'Kane realizes that the Japanese crew is probably not paying attention and not expecting to find an American submarine on the surface this deep in Japanese-controlled waters. So they are just sailing their assigned patrol route on autopilot without actually looking for threats. O'Kane quickly calculates his options and realizes he can either dive and hide, which will consume precious battery power, or he can fight on the surface using the deck gun, which might or might not work after sitting unmaintained since the explosion that killed the regular gun crew. Tang has no torpedoes remaining after expending all 24 weapons during the previous patrols and last night's attack, so the only weapon available is the 3-inch deck gun mounted on the forward deck, but that gun has not been manned or maintained since the explosion and might be corroded or damaged or simply inoperable after exposure to seawater. O'Kane decides to fight rather than dive because diving will drain the battery and guarantee they never reach Ishigaki, while fighting gives them at least a chance of sinking the patrol boat and continuing on their way. So he orders man the deck gun, and Gunnery Officer Lieutenant Richard Croth climbs topside with 3 volunteers, including Seaman First Class Jesse Harper, Seaman Second Class Dennis Sullivan, and Fireman First Class Joseph Burton. Croth inspects the deck gun carefully and finds it corroded from seawater exposure with a stiff breech mechanism and a loose aiming system. But the firing pin appears to be functional, and there is 1 round already loaded in the chamber with 23 additional rounds stored in the ready locker beside the gun mount. Croth reports to O'Kane that the gun is operational, but barely, and O'Kane orders him to wait until the patrol boat closes to 3 miles range before opening fire to maximize the chances of hitting with the first shot, which might be the most important shot they fire. The patrol boat continues approaching steadily at 6 miles range, then 5 miles, then 4 miles without showing any sign of having spotted Tang, and O'Kane cannot understand how they remain invisible to the Japanese lookouts, but he is grateful for their incompetence or laziness or whatever is preventing them from seeing an American submarine sitting on the surface in plain sight. At 3 miles range, O'Kane orders open fire, and Croth aims the gun carefully and pulls the firing trigger, and the gun roars and recoils and sends a 3-inch shell racing toward the patrol boat. But O'Kane watches through binoculars and sees the shell land 50 yards short in a tall splash that alerts the Japanese crew that they are under attack. Croth adjusts his aim and fires again, and this shot lands 30 yards short, and now the patrol boat is turning hard and accelerating to 18 knots while zig-agging to make itself a difficult target, and Croth fires repeatedly while trying to walk his shells onto the target through trial and error since the gun sights are not properly calibrated. After several misses, Croth finally achieves a direct hit on the patrol boat's bow, which explodes dramatically and slows the ship down, and he fires again and scores another hit that leaves the patrol boat dead in the water and sinking bow first, and the Japanese crew begins abandoning ship and jumping into the ocean to escape the sinking vessel. O'Kane watches through binoculars as approximately 30 Japanese sailors hit the water and begin swimming, though some stop swimming almost immediately and disappear beneath the surface, while the survivors wave their arms not at Tang, but at the sky as they pray for rescue from a patrol plane or another ship. O'Kane knows that some of these men will probably survive long enough to be rescued, and when they are rescued, they will report seeing Tang heading south toward Ishigaki Island, which will bring Japanese naval forces hunting for them with renewed intensity. O'Kane considers using the deck gun to kill the survivors in the water to prevent them from reporting, but he cannot bring himself to order his crew to murder defenseless men floating in the ocean. So instead, he orders Tang to move away quickly and leave the survivors behind to either drown or be rescued, depending on how quickly help arrives. Tang moves south away from the sinking patrol boat and its swimming survivors, and O'Kane watches through binoculars as the men in the water become smaller and more distant until he can no longer distinguish individual heads or arms, and eventually they disappear completely over the horizon. O'Kane tells himself that letting enemy combatants die of exposure is different from actively killing them, and he wants desperately to believe that this distinction matters morally and ethically. But deep down, he knows that the men are dying either way, regardless of whether Tang shoots them or lets them drown naturally, and the guilt of this decision settles heavily on his shoulders alongside all the other impossible decisions he has made during this patrol. O'Kane makes himself continue watching the empty ocean where the survivors used to be visible, forcing himself to witness the consequences of his command decisions rather than looking away and pretending it did not happen, because he believes that if you give an order that results in men dying, then you have an obligation to watch them die rather than hiding from the reality of what you have done. At 14:20 hours after traveling another 14 miles closer to Ishigaki Island, Springer reports that the battery has drained down to only 18 hours of remaining capacity, which means they have burned through 14 hours of battery life to cover just 14 miles of distance, when they still have 56 miles remaining to reach their destination. The mathematics of their situation are getting progressively worse with each passing hour, because 56 miles at 2 knots requires 28 hours of travel time, but they only have 18 hours of battery power remaining, leaving them 10 hours short of reaching Ishigaki, even if absolutely nothing else goes wrong, and no more emergencies force them to dive or consume additional power. O'Kane asks Springer desperately whether there is any way to extend the battery life by shutting down more systems or reducing speed even further. But Springer explains that they have already shut down every non-essential system aboard Tang, and the only way to extend battery life now would be to stop moving completely and drift, which would eliminate any chance of reaching land before the batteries die, or Japanese forces find them. At 16:50 hours, Savadkin reports yet another life-threatening problem developing in the after compartments, where carbon monoxide fumes are seeping into the berthing areas from the flooded engine room, where diesel fuel is leaking and mixing with seawater to create toxic fumes that are poisoning the men trapped in those compartments. 3 men have already lost consciousness from carbon monoxide exposure, and Walker is treating them with emergency oxygen masks. But the oxygen supply is severely limited and will last perhaps 6 more hours before running out completely, after which those men will die unless the fumes stop or someone finds a way to evacuate them from the contaminated compartments. Savadkin requests permission to seal the after compartments completely to prevent the carbon monoxide from spreading forward into the rest of the submarine and poisoning the entire crew. And O'Kane immediately understands the horrifying implications of this request, because sealing those compartments means trapping 14 men in a space that is filling with toxic fumes and condemning them to slow death by poisoning. O'Kane makes perhaps the most agonizing decision of his entire naval career by ordering the after compartments sealed to save the 65 men forward of the seals at the cost of the 14 men trapped aft. And motor machinist second class Frank Miller is in the afterberthing compartment when he hears the announcement over the intercom ordering all after compartments to be sealed immediately. Miller runs toward the watertight door connecting his compartment to the rest of the submarine, but he is still 10 feet away when Chief Torpedoman William Leibold begins dogging the door shut from the other side following O'Kane's orders, and Miller pounds on the door and shouts for Leibold to wait and let him through. But Leibold just looks at Miller through the small window in the door and shakes his head sadly while explaining that he cannot disobey the captain's direct order. Miller understands that he is being deliberately left behind to die, and he steps back from the door and looks around at the other 13 men trapped in the compartment with him, and everyone understands what this means and how much time they have left before the carbon monoxide reaches lethal concentration and kills them all. Miller sits down on a bunk and pulls out a pack of cigarettes and lights one and takes a long drag, and when electrician second-class Robert Decker sees this, he starts laughing with dark gallows humor at the absurdity of smoking cigarettes while being poisoned by carbon monoxide fumes, and he asks Miller for a cigarette, and soon all 14 trapped men are smoking and filling the compartment with tobacco smoke that mixes with the diesel fumes to create a truly toxic atmosphere. Motor machinist, first class. Arnold Peterson coughs hard and says, "This is the stupidest thing he has ever done in his life, smoking while being poisoned by fumes," and everyone laughs because what else can they do when they are trapped with no escape and no rescue coming and no hope of survival? They cannot stop the fumes or open the sealed doors or call for help that will never arrive. So instead they smoke and talk and tell stories from their lives before the war, and carefully avoid mentioning the headaches that are starting, or the nausea, or the dizziness, or checking the time to calculate how many hours they have left before unconsciousness and death. Because acknowledging their approaching death makes it real, and keeping it unreal makes it slightly more bearable, even though they all know exactly what is coming for them. At 1847 hours, as the sun sets and darkness falls across the ocean, Tang has been moving for 14 hours since dawn and has covered 28 miles of distance toward Ishigaki Island, leaving 28 miles still remaining with only 12 hours of battery life available, according to Springer's latest calculation. The mathematics still do not work and never will work, because 28 miles at 2 knots requires 14 hours, while they only have 12 hours of power remaining. But O'Kane keeps pushing Tang forward anyway, because stopping means giving up, and giving up means death. And as long as the submarine is moving, there remains some tiny possibility of a miracle or unexpected help, or some solution that O'Kane has not yet considered. O'Kane remains on the bridge throughout the night, watching for threats in every direction, watching for lights on the horizon that might indicate Japanese ships, watching for anything that might kill them before they have a chance to reach land, and at least die on solid ground, rather than drowning in this goddamn ocean that has been trying to kill them for the past 40 hours. At 21:30 hours, Springer climbs wearily up to the bridge and requests permission to speak privately with O'Kane. And when O'Kane grants permission, Springer delivers a brutally honest assessment of their situation by explaining that the battery now has only 10 hours of capacity remaining, while they still need 14 hours to reach Ishigaki Island, making it mathematically impossible to complete the journey before power runs out. Springer suggests very carefully that perhaps they should consider alternatives, such as scuttling the submarine properly, or surrendering to Japanese forces, or attempting to swim to land, or something other than continuing this futile attempt to reach an island that the mathematics prove they cannot possibly reach before the batteries die. O'Kane listens to this suggestion and then responds firmly that they are not discussing alternatives because the only acceptable option is reaching Ishigaki Island, and if the mathematics say it is impossible, then they will simply have to do the impossible, because there is no third option available, and that is a direct order which ends this discussion immediately. Springer stares at O'Kane for several long seconds, trying to decide whether to argue further or simply accept the captain's decision. And finally Springer nods and says, "Yes, sir," and climbs back down to the control room to continue monitoring the dying battery while O'Kane remains alone on the bridge. O'Kane knows with absolute certainty that Springer is correct, and the mathematics prove they cannot reach Ishigaki before the battery dies. But O'Kane also knows that admitting this reality to the crew means they will give up and lose hope, and once hope is gone, then everyone will simply wait to die, instead of fighting for every last mile and every last minute of survival. So O'Kane will lie to his crew and pretend there is still hope and push them forward until the battery dies, or they reach land, or something kills them, whichever comes first, because that is what command means. lying to keep men alive and hoping desperately that the lie somehow becomes true before anyone discovers it was always impossible. At 22:10 hours, Leibold reports multiple propeller contacts on bearing 090 at unknown range and closing. And O'Kane listens carefully and hears diesel engines and ship propellers indicating multiple vessels in formation, probably 4 to 6 ships approaching from the east and heading west directly toward Tang's position. O'Kane orders emergency dive yet again, and Tang's vents open and the submarine submerges and descends to 180 feet depth, while everyone aboard goes completely silent and listens to the ships passing overhead, and Leibold counts 6 distinct propeller signatures identifying them as destroyer escorts, conducting an organized search pattern looking specifically for Tang after the patrol boat survivors were rescued and reported the submarine's location and heading. The first destroyer passes directly overhead, close enough that Leibold reports he can hear individual propeller blade strikes making a rhythmic thumping sound like a clock counting down to their deaths, and then come the splashes of depth charges hitting the water and sinking toward Tang's depth. O'Kane counts the explosions as they detonate, and the first 4 charges explode at approximately 60 feet depth, which is too shallow to damage Tang at 180 feet. But then the 5th charge explodes much deeper at approximately 150 feet, and the pressure wave hits Tang hard enough to shatter light bulbs and crack pipes and throw men against bulkheads, proving that the Japanese are learning and adapting by setting their depth charge fuses deeper to compensate for the defect that has been protecting American submarines throughout the war. The destroyers make 3 more passes, dropping additional depth charges with each pass, and each time some of the charges explode deeper than before, at 150 feet, then 160 feet, then 170 feet. And although none of the charges explode close enough to cause serious damage, they are getting progressively closer with each attack, demonstrating clearly that Tang's secret advantage is eroding rapidly as the Japanese learn to compensate for their defective fuses by setting them much deeper than standard doctrine recommends. Eventually, the destroyers move off to search other areas, and Tang waits submerged for another 30 minutes before finally surfacing at 2330 hours to resume the journey toward Ishigaki Island, with the battery now depleted to just 10 hours remaining and 28 miles still to travel, and O'Kane orders resume course at 2 knots, knowing that the mathematics guarantee failure but refusing to stop trying, because stopping means dying, and he is not ready to let his crew die, not yet, not while there remains even the smallest possibility of reaching land before the battery dies, and Tang becomes nothing more than a dead hulk drifting in enemy waters, waiting for the next Japanese patrol to find them and finish what the circular run torpedo started 40 hours ago. October 26, 1944, at 0340 hours, Tang drifts 12 miles from Ishigaki Island, with only 4 hours of battery life remaining when the brutal mathematics show they need 6 hours at current speed, leaving them 2 hours short with no options except continuing forward because stopping means accepting death for all 79 surviving crew members. O'Kane has been awake for 51 consecutive hours, standing watch while his body shuts down and his vision shows phantom ships that disappear when he blinks, and his legs shake uncontrollably while his mind wages a desperate battle to maintain consciousness because falling asleep means missing the threat that will kill them all. Below deck, Torpedo Man. Clayton Decker lies unconscious from complete exhaustion after his body finally gave up and shut down, and pharmacist Hayes Walker checks his dangerously slow pulse of 45 beats per minute while recognizing severe hypothermia because the submarine's internal temperature dropped to 52 degrees after they shut down heating to conserve battery power. In the sealed after compartments, all 14 trapped men have lost consciousness as carbon monoxide reached lethal concentration 4 hours earlier, with motor machinist Frank Miller passing out first from smoking, while electrician Arnold Peterson followed at 22:10 hours, and now all 14 men breathe shallowly while dying slowly from poison, with nobody forward of the sealed doors able to help them, or even knowing they are dying. At 0420 hours, engineer Springer reports only 3 hours of battery life remaining, which means the battery dies at 0720 hours, when Tang will still be 6 miles from Ishigaki. And Springer suggests reducing speed to 1 knot to extend battery life to 5 hours and get within 2 miles instead of being stranded 6 miles out. O'Kane makes the agonizing decision to slow down despite knowing it means spending more time exposed where Japanese aircraft can spot them. And Tang crawls forward at 1 nautical mile per hour toward an island that remains frustratingly distant but definitely getting closer. At 0530 hours, the sun rises in brilliant orange light that O'Kane watches with dread because daylight means visibility and being spotted by Japanese patrol aircraft. But Tang lacks battery power to dive and hide, so O'Kane makes the calculated decision to remain surfaced and hope their luck holds. At 0612 hours, Leibold reports aircraft contact approaching from bearing 270, and O'Kane must decide instantly whether to dive and probably die underwater when the battery runs out or stay surfaced and hope the pilot misses them somehow. O'Kane orders prepare to dive, but Springer reports they might have 30 minutes submerged before the battery dies and leaves them stuck at depth unable to surface. So O'Kane makes the agonizing choice to remain surfaced and hope desperately for luck. The Japanese Nakajima reconnaissance plane approaches at 5 miles, then 4 miles, then 3 miles, and O'Kane orders everyone below deck to reduce Tang's visible profile, while the aircraft continues at 2 miles range, where every detail becomes clearly visible. The plane passes directly overhead at 1 mile range without turning or signaling or attacking, and O'Kane cannot believe the pilot missed seeing a large submarine sitting on the surface in perfect daylight. But whatever the reason, they escape once again, even though their luck cannot possibly hold much longer. At 0735 hours, the battery dies completely with Tang still 5 miles from Ishigaki, and Springer reports 0 power remaining as the motors stop and lights go dark and ventilation shuts down and everything goes silent. O'Kane stares at Ishigaki through binoculars and sees buildings and roads that might as well be on the moon, because 5 miles of open ocean separates Tang from land, with no way to cover that distance without power. Executive Officer O'Hara delivers the situation report confirming 65 men alive forward and 14 probably dead aft, and then speaks the dreaded words that they need to abandon ship immediately before remaining strength runs out, or Japanese forces find them. O'Kane feels something breaking inside at the thought of leaving Tang and failing his fundamental duty as captain to bring his ship home. But he knows staying aboard means everyone dies, while abandoning ship means some might survive by reaching land. O'Kane gives the order that breaks his heart by saying they will abandon ship and attempt to reach Ishigaki using emergency rafts and strong swimmers, and the crew moves slowly because they cannot quite believe their captain is ordering them to leave Tang after 5 war patrols and 24 confirmed kills. The crew inflates 6 yellow rafts and divides into groups, loading 32 men into 4 rafts at 8 men each, while 10 volunteers, including Leibold, Springer, Hayes, and Burton, step forward to swim the 5 miles, despite knowing perhaps half will die from hypothermia or exhaustion or cramping. But before launching, Medical Officer Savadkin reminds O'Kane about the 14 sealed men, and motor machinist Arnold Walker volunteers to check them by entering the toxic compartment with breathing apparatus. Walker finds Miller with no pulse and cold skin, then Peterson dead, and he checks all 14 men while fumes burn his lungs before staggering out and reporting to O'Kane that all 14 are dead from carbon monoxide poisoning. O'Kane determines he will be last off Tang following naval tradition, despite O'Hara's arguments that O'Kane should lead by leaving first, but O'Kane refuses to discuss it and simply states he will be last because that is what captains do. At 0820 hours, the 4 rafts launch, and 32 exhausted crew members begin rowing toward Ishigaki, while 10 swimmers prepare to enter cold water, and O'Kane watches from Tang's deck as his crew abandons the submarine and rows away, leaving him standing alone. O'Kane walks Tang's length one final time, touching the conning tower and deck gun and saying goodbye to the submarine that carried him through 5 patrols but could not survive the final mission, and O'Kane finally climbs into the 5th raft after ensuring every other living soul has left, and he pushes away from Tang while looking back to watch the submarine growing smaller and more distant until she disappears over the horizon. The rafts move at perhaps half a knot as exhausted men row with trembling arms while the current pushes north, and they row south, making barely any progress despite desperate efforts, and O'Kane sets the pace while encouraging others to keep working even though the island looks impossibly distant. The 10 swimmers enter the water and begin swimming with Leibold leading, using strong freestyle, while Springer follows with less efficient breaststroke, and Hayes brings up the rear, using awkward sidestroke that shows he is not naturally strong, but volunteered anyway, because leaving men behind was morally unacceptable. At 11:30 hours after 3 hours swimming, Seaman Robert Hayes stops and floats face down as his body shuts down from hypothermia and exhaustion. And Leibold swims back to find Hayes conscious but severely hypothermic, with pale skin and blue lips and core temperature below 90 degrees. Leibold tries desperately to rouse Hayes, but the nearest raft is 50 yards away, and Leibold is exhausted and cramping and knows attempting to tow Hayes will kill them both. So Leibold makes the agonizing calculation that he must choose between his friend's life and his own survival. Leibold tries once more to wake Hayes by shouting and shaking him, but Hayes just looks at Leibold with unfocused dying eyes and whispers, "Tell my wife," before closing his eyes and stopping breathing and sinking slowly beneath the surface. Leibold watches his friend disappear into dark water as a gradually fading shape that gets darker, then vanishes completely, and Leibold floats motionless for 30 seconds, crying before forcing himself to start swimming because Hayes died, so Leibold could live, and wasting that sacrifice would be worse than anything. At 13:40 hours, fireman Joseph Burton stops swimming as his legs cramp and paralyze him and drag him under before he can call for help. And Springer swims quickly to the spot and dives trying to find Burton, but cannot dive deep enough to reach him before his lungs give out. So Springer surfaces empty-handed, realizing Burton is gone and dead with nothing anyone can do except keep swimming. At 16:50 hours, motor machinist Henry Flanagan dies in a raft from massive heart attack brought on by exhaustion and dehydration and stress, and the crew removes his body to reduce weight and lays it gently in the water where it drifts away and sinks while they resume rowing. At 17:40 hours after 9 brutal hours, the first raft hits the beach, and 32 men collapse on sand, unable to move after pushing far beyond human endurance limits. And the other rafts arrive over 20 minutes, while swimmers arrive in scattered groups, with 8 successfully completing the swim, but 2 drowning somewhere in the 5 miles between Tang and Ishigaki. O'Kane lies on the beach calculating that 45 men reached land alive, while 22 died during the patrol, including 8 from the torpedo explosion, 14 from carbon monoxide poisoning, and 8 during the swim to shore, which means 87 men started and 45 survived, for a 52% survival rate that O'Kane cannot determine represents success or failure. 20 minutes after the last raft arrives, 15 Japanese soldiers find the exhausted Americans lying helplessly on the beach and shout commands in Japanese that the Americans do not understand, but the meaning is clear from pointed weapons and aggressive gestures. The Tang crew makes no attempt to resist because they lack physical capability after 9 hours of rowing and swimming, so they raise their hands and lie still while Japanese soldiers search them and bind their hands behind their backs. A Japanese sergeant who speaks English approaches O'Kane and asks, "You captain?" And O'Kane nods, and the sergeant says, "You come long way to die here." And O'Kane responds, "We came long way to survive," which surprises the sergeant, who nods respectfully before ordering his men to march the prisoners inland. The 45 surviving crew members stand slowly and form a ragged column with bound hands and legs barely supporting their weight, and they begin marching away from the beach toward whatever fate awaits them as prisoners of war. O'Kane walks at the front, leading even in defeat with 44 exhausted men following behind who survived impossible odds and made it to land against all mathematical probability. And O'Kane does not look back at the ocean or think about Tang drifting somewhere waiting to sink, because looking back means confronting everything he lost and everyone who died and all the decisions that seemed right but led to this ending. O'Kane just puts one foot in front of the other and walks inland and survives one more hour, because survival is the only victory left and the only thing he can still control after everything else was taken away by war and fate and a single malfunctioning torpedo that destroyed Tang and killed 22 men and brought O'Kane's remarkable career to an end on a beach in enemy territory 78 miles from where the nightmare began 50 hours earlier. November 15, 1944, 22 days after Tang sank, Commander O'Kane sits in a 6-by-8-foot cell at Ofuna Interrogation Camp 40 miles southwest of Tokyo, where he has spent 3 weeks refusing to answer Captain Yamada's daily questions about Tang's operations and American submarine tactics. Yamada enters at 900 hours as always and sits across from O'Kane before opening a folder and saying in perfect English, "We recovered documents from Tang before she sank too deep to salvage, and your logbook shows something fascinating about your 5 war patrols and 24 confirmed kills. Specifically, that Tang survived 47 separate depth charge attacks without sustaining serious damage, which seems statistically impossible unless our weapons were systematically malfunctioning." O'Kane maintains complete silence while Yamada continues. "We are not fools, Commander. We have known for months that our depth charges explode too shallow due to manufacturing defects in the fuse mechanisms, and we have been studying why American submarines keep surviving attacks that should destroy them, which led us directly to identifying and correcting the flaw by producing new variable depth fuses that explode anywhere between 50 and 250 feet. Yamada leans forward and delivers his psychological blow by saying, "Your survival actually helped us fix this problem because we analyzed your escape patterns and realized our weapons were failing consistently. So in a very real sense, your remarkable record has contributed to improving our ability to kill your fellow submariners going forward, and you should take pride in knowing that Tang taught us valuable lessons about depth charge effectiveness." O'Kane feels something crack inside as he realizes the defect that saved Tang might now kill future American submarines because the Japanese learned and adapted, but O'Kane refuses to respond or show emotion because engaging with Yamada's psychological warfare only validates the tactic. Yamada closes his folder and says, "You will remain here until the war ends, whether that takes 1 year or 5 years or longer. And I hope you survive, Commander, because I respect your capabilities, but you should understand that you have made the Imperial Japanese Navy more deadly than we were before Tang sank." December 8, 1944, O'Kane is working in the prison garden when Engineer Springer approaches quietly and whispers, "A guard told me that American submarine Celion sank the carrier Shinano last week, but then the guard claimed Celion was destroyed 2 days later by new depth charges that killed all 84 crew members." O'Kane stops breathing as the implications crash over him, because if Celion died from improved depth charges, then O'Kane's survival might have directly contributed to those deaths by revealing the defect pattern that Japanese analysts exploited. The guilt settles heavily on O'Kane's shoulders alongside all the other impossible burdens he carries from decisions that seemed right at the time but led to unintended consequences he could never have predicted or prevented. March 12, 1945, 5 months into captivity, O'Kane has lost 38 pounds and now weighs only 142 pounds as starvation slowly destroys his body, while Japanese guards systematically reduce food rations from 800 calories per day down to less than 300 calories as punishment and revenge for their losing war. 3 POWs died last month from malnutrition and disease, and O'Kane wonders daily whether he will be next, but he refuses to give the Japanese the satisfaction of watching him die, so he exercises obsessively in his cell to maintain whatever strength and mental clarity he can preserve, despite brutal conditions. Torpedo man William Leibold is dying faster than O'Kane, having dropped from 180 pounds to barely 120 pounds in 5 months, and Leibold lies in his bunk most days, staring at nothing while replaying the memory of Hayes drowning and the moment when Leibold chose his own survival over his friend's life. O'Kane visits daily and tries to motivate Leibold to keep fighting, but Leibold is drowning in guilt, and the psychological weight is killing him more effectively than starvation or disease. April 3, 1945, at 03:40 hours, O'Kane wakes to the sound of Leibold drowning in pneumonia as fluid fills his lungs and blocks his airways, and O'Kane goes to his dying friend and holds his hand while Leibold whispers his haunting question. "Captain, did I do right letting Hayes go? Was I supposed to die with him instead of choosing to survive?" O'Kane squeezes Leibold's hand and says with absolute conviction, "You did right. Hayes was already dead, and trying to save him would have killed you both, and Hayes would have wanted you to survive and return home, so you made the right choice and have nothing to feel guilty about." Leibold's breathing becomes more labored, and he whispers, "Tell Hayes I am sorry," before closing his eyes and simply letting go of life with the same peaceful surrender that Hayes showed 5 months earlier. O'Kane sits with Leibold's body for 10 minutes before calling the guards who remove the corpse and throw it into a mass grave with no ceremony or acknowledgement that Leibold was once a skilled sonar operator who saved Tang dozens of times. August 15, 1945, the war ends with Japan's surrender after atomic bombs destroy Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Emperor Hirohito announces surrender in a radio broadcast that leaves the prison guards stunned and defeated. The guards abandon their posts, and the 45 Tang survivors who entered Ofuna now number only 38 because 7 men died during 9 months of captivity from starvation and disease and beatings and despair. American forces arrive on August 20th with medics and food and transportation to hospitals, and doctors weigh O'Kane at 142 pounds compared to his pre-capture 180 pounds, and say he is relatively lucky compared to prisoners who lost 60 or 70 pounds and died within days of liberation because their bodies were too damaged to recover. September 2, 1945, O'Kane stands on USS Missouri's deck in Tokyo Bay, watching Japan formally surrender, while General MacArthur delivers a speech about peace and hope. But O'Kane feels nothing except empty and hollow, and used up because he lost Tang and 49 men, and spent 9 months as a POW, and survived when better men died. And he cannot make sense of the suffering, or feel proud of victory that cost so much, and changed him so fundamentally. October 20th, 1945, exactly 1 year after Tang sank, O'Kane waits at Pearl Harbor for his flight home when Commander Ellis from Naval Intelligence approaches and says, "We need to debrief you about your patrols and experiences." They go to an office, and Ellis asks about the depth charge failures, and O'Kane explains the systematic shallow detonations and apparent fuse defects. Ellis nods and says, "We have been tracking this for 2 years with a 73% failure rate across thousands of attacks, and this systematic manufacturing defect saved hundreds of submarines and thousands of submariners, making it one of the most significant intelligence advantages of the entire Pacific submarine campaign." O'Kane asks about Celian and whether his survival pattern taught the Japanese anything useful, and Ellis delivers information that changes everything by saying, "Celian was not sunk by depth charges, as your guard claimed, because Celian actually survived the entire war and returned to Pearl Harbor in September 1945 with her crew intact, so whoever told you Celian was destroyed was lying deliberately to demoralize you and break your spirit." O'Kane feels relief and confusion and anger as he realizes he spent 5 months carrying guilt for deaths that never happened because the story was fabricated psychological warfare. Ellis continues, The Japanese did fix their fuses eventually, but by then we had over 200 submarines operating, and they could not kill us fast enough to matter strategically, because we were strangling their supply lines, and the depth charges were irrelevant whether they worked or not. Ellis says, "One more thing, Commander. You are being awarded the Medal of Honor for your actions during Tang's final patrol, and President Truman will present it at the White House on March 27, 1946. O'Kane nods politely and says, "Thank you," even though medals seem meaningless compared to the 49 men who died, but he accepts, because that is what people expect. O'Kane flies home to California, where his wife meets him at the airport and hugs him and cries, and O'Kane holds her silently because he cannot explain what happened or describe what he lost or convey that he is not the same man who left in September 1944. March 27, 1946, President Truman presents O'Kane with the Medal of Honor during a White House ceremony, and the citation reads, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty," while describing how O'Kane kept his crew alive through brilliant seamanship after Tang was struck by a malfunctioning torpedo. The audience applauds, and afterward a reporter asks how it feels to be a hero, and O'Kane thinks carefully before saying, "I am not a hero, I am a survivor." And there is a fundamental difference because heroes die for something greater, while survivors simply refuse to die. And I refused, which makes me a survivor, but not necessarily a hero. The reporter asks for clarification, but O'Kane has nothing more to say. O'Kane walks away with the Medal of Honor in hand and Tang forever in his heart, knowing he will carry this weight for the rest of his life, regardless of medals or recognition from civilians who can never understand what happened in the Taiwan Strait. That night, O'Kane dreams about Tang, and in the dream, he descends with the submarine through 60 feet and 100 feet and 150 feet until reaching 180 feet, where Tang rests on the bottom, surrounded by darkness and crushing pressure. O'Kane looks up and sees the surface impossibly far above, with sunlight streaming down, and he reaches upward, trying to swim toward that distant light and escape, but he cannot rise because he is too heavy with guilt and the weight of 49 dead crew members who surround him in darkness and stare with accusing eyes, asking why he survived when they died. O'Kane wakes, gasping and shaking beside his sleeping wife, and he considers telling her about the dream, but instead lies silently waiting for morning while thinking about survival and guilt and the price of living when so many died. O'Kane understands that surviving the war was not the end, but rather the beginning of learning to live while drowning in memories that never fade, and guilt that never diminishes, and questions with no satisfying answers about who lives and who dies when submarines sink and everything goes wrong. O'Kane closes his eyes and sinks back into the dream and back to 180 feet, where Tang waits, because this is what survival means now and forever, not escaping the war, but learning to carry it always, and knowing that part of him died with Tang and will never return no matter how many years pass or medals he receives, because survivors eventually become ghosts, and the ocean never releases what it has claimed in the cold, dark depths, where Tang rests eternally with 22 men who never came home.